She told the world that social media was engineered to cause depression in teenagers. She had the internal data. Her own company tried to delete her from history. They didn't fire her. They didn't sue her. They didn't send a cease and desist. They didn't threaten her publicly or privately. They did something that takes more resources, more planning, and more cold deliberation than any of those things. They rewrote the company's internal records to make it look like she had never worked there. 4 years of performance reviews. Gone. 4 years of internal emails, research submissions, team meeting notes, project assignments. Gone. Her employee profile, her access logs, her name in the acknowledgement sections of 14 internal studies she had personally designed and executed. All of it methodically removed from every server the company controlled. Then she walked into a Senate hearing room, sat down at the witness table, adjusted the microphone, and placed one item on the table in front of her. Her original employee badge, still laminated, still showing her face, still showing her name, still showing her title. Senior Behavioral Research Scientist, still showing the company logo in full color. My name is Elena Marsh. I worked for this company for 4 years. I know they will tell you I didn't. I kept the badge. The room went completely silent. This is the story of what she found, what she did with it, what they did to her, and why it changed the way we understand one of the most powerful industries in human history. This is Cold Reckoning. Stay with me. Before we go inside that hearing room, we need to understand who Elena Marsh was before any of this happened. Because her story doesn't begin with a whistleblower decision. It begins much earlier in a place that has nothing to do with social media. Elena Marsh grew up in Akron, Ohio. Her mother was a public school counselor. Her father worked at a tire manufacturing plant for 22 years before the plant closed, and he spent 3 years trying to find work that paid close to the same. She watched her father's confidence erode in real time. She watched what prolonged uncertainty does to a person's sense of self. That observation never left her. She studied psychology at Ohio State, then got a master's in behavioral economics at the University of Michigan. Her thesis was on what she called manufactured urgency, the way certain systems, from casino design to subscription billing, create artificial states of anxiety that drive compulsive decision-making. She graduated at the top of her program. She was recruited out of graduate school by 3 companies. She chose the social media company because their pitch was the most idealistic. We are building connection, we are reducing loneliness, we are giving a voice to people who have never had one. She believed them. She needed to believe someone was doing this work responsibly. She wanted to be part of making it right. She was 27 years old when she signed her employment contract. She had no idea what she was walking into. Her first assignment was straightforward. Analyze engagement patterns among users aged 13 to 24 on the platform's main content feed. How long were they staying? What made them stop scrolling? What made them come back? Standard product research. Every technology company does some version of this work. What she found in the first 6 months was interesting but not alarming. Younger users engaged more with video content. They responded to social validation signals, likes, comments, shares, more intensely than older users. They returned to the app more frequently throughout the day, with peak usage clustering around 10 p.m. to midnight. Familiar findings, nothing that hadn't been observed before. Then her team was given access to a deeper layer of the data. The company had been running what it internally called a cohort behavioral mapping program for several years before Marsh arrived. This program didn't just track what users did on the platform. It tracked what happened to users over time, cross-referencing platform behavior with external data the company had purchased or inferred from device activity, location patterns, and third-party app integrations. In plain language, they weren't just watching what you did on the app. They were building a picture of what the app was doing to you. Marsh's team was brought in to analyze one specific segment of this data, the 13 to 17 demographic. Specifically, the company wanted to understand what they were internally calling high-retention users, teenagers who spent significantly more time on the platform than average. The business question, as it was framed to her team, was, what does this group have in common, and how do we replicate that engagement in a broader population? It took her team 4 months to produce the first comprehensive report. Marsh wrote most of it herself. She submitted it on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, her department head had called her into a private meeting and asked her to consider the framing of certain findings before the report went to the product team. She asked what he meant by framing. He said the data was real, nobody was disputing the data, but there were ways of contextualizing findings that were more productive for cross-team collaboration. She asked him to be specific. He was not specific. She rewrote nothing. She resubmitted the original report. What was in that report? Let me tell you exactly. The highest retention teenagers on the platform, the ones spending 4, 5, 6 or more hours per day, showed a measurable and statistically significant correlation with 3 specific outcomes when compared to similar age users with lower platform engagement. First, elevated anxiety indicators, measured through a combination of platform behavior patterns and cross-referenced external health data. Specifically, disrupted sleep patterns, increased late-night usage spikes, and what the data scientists on her team identified as reassurance-seeking loops, patterns of posting, then compulsively checking for response, then posting again, in cycles that accelerated over time. Second, measurable increases in what the internal documents called appearance-related distress signals among female users aged 13 to 16. This included increased engagement with content flagged internally as related to body image, weight, and cosmetic comparison, alongside behavioral changes consistent with what clinical literature would recognize as early indicators of disordered eating. Third, and this is the one that stops people cold when they hear it for the first time, the internal data showed that high engagement users in this demographic, who were identified through behavioral signals as potentially experiencing depression or social isolation, showed not a decrease in platform usage but an increase. The algorithm was not neutral to their distress. It was feeding them content that correlated with deeper engagement. Their pain was profitable. The internal document that summarized these findings, written by a data analyst 2 years before Marsh arrived, used a phrase that she would later repeat in her congressional testimony. The phrase was acceptable friction. The negative outcomes for these users had been reviewed, categorized, and filed under a term that suggested they were a known and tolerated cost of doing business. Acceptable friction. Think about what that means. Someone sat in a conference room. Someone looked at data showing that teenagers were developing anxiety disorders, disordered eating, and compulsive behavioral loops as a result of using the product. Someone wrote those words down, and then the document was filed, and then the product continued. And then the algorithm continued to be optimized for the engagement patterns that correlated with those outcomes. Marsh submitted 3 more reports over the following 2 years. Each one built on the previous findings with additional data. Each one was more specific, more statistically robust, and more difficult to dismiss. Each one was received with the same response: acknowledgement, a meeting, a conversation about framing, no action. By her 3rd year, she had been promoted twice. The company valued her work. They valued it so much that they didn't want it leaving the building. She received a significant salary increase and what her HR file described as a retention bonus. She understood what the retention was for. They wanted to keep her inside the walls where her findings could be managed. She began keeping copies. Not because she had decided to go public. She hadn't decided anything yet. She kept copies because she was a scientist, and scientists preserve data. She stored nothing on company systems. She committed the most critical numbers to memory the way a musician commits a piece to muscle memory, through repetition, through ritual, through an act of will that becomes, eventually, automatic. She knew, even then, that a document can be seized. A number inside a human mind cannot. In her 4th year, something happened that changed her calculation entirely. A journalist published an investigation into the mental health outcomes of teenage girls and social media use. The investigation was serious, the sourcing was solid, and one section of it described internal research at a major platform that suggested the company knew its product was harmful to young users. The description was vague enough that no specific company could be identified. But Marsh knew, reading it, that the journalist had found an edge of the same mountain she was standing on. The company's response was immediate and overwhelming. The legal team, the communications team, and a crisis management firm they had on retainer all activated within hours. The public statement was careful and confident. The company took user well-being seriously. The reporting mischaracterized internal research processes. The company had robust safeguards for its youngest users. Marsh read the statement 3 times. She had written some of the research being mischaracterized. She knew what robust meant inside those walls. It meant the study existed. It did not mean anything had changed. She wrote her resignation letter that weekend. She was careful. She was a behavioral scientist who had spent 4 years studying how institutions manage information. She knew exactly what was coming. She wrote a resignation letter that stated her reasons in broad terms, attached a 1-page summary of her core findings with no proprietary documents, no copied files, no screenshots, just numbers, her numbers, the ones she had run herself. The legal team's response came in 3 hours and 14 minutes. She timed it. The offer was $4 million and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The NDA was 47 pages. She read all 47 pages. Then she called a lawyer she had identified 3 months earlier, a woman who specialized in whistleblower cases and had never represented anyone from this particular industry. The lawyer read the NDA overnight. The next morning, the lawyer called her and said, "They wrote this to cover everything you've seen and everything you might have saved. But there's a gap. The NDA covers documents, it covers files, it covers proprietary data and internal communications. It does not explicitly cover information you carry in your own memory. It cannot cover what you know. It can only cover what you can prove you took." Marsh had taken nothing. Every copy she had ever made was on a personal hard drive she had destroyed 6 months earlier, after she had committed the numbers to memory. She had left no trail. She had taken no documents. She had only taken herself. She signed the NDA. She accepted $1 of the $4 million. $1 to make the contract binding. She left $3,999,999 on the table. She wanted them to know she hadn't done it for the money. She was contacted by a Senate subcommittee staffer 8 weeks later. A senator on the committee had read the journalist's investigation. The committee was preparing hearings on social media and adolescent mental health. They were looking for witnesses who had worked inside the industry. Marsh agreed to testify. She called her lawyer. Her lawyer reviewed the NDA one more time. The testimony Marsh planned to give cited no documents, referenced no files, quoted no internal communications. It consisted entirely of numbers she had calculated herself, methodology she had designed herself, and conclusions she had reached through her own analysis. The NDA had no reach over any of it. The night before the hearing, Marsh did not sleep. She sat in her hotel room in Washington and went through the numbers one more time, not because she was uncertain, because she had spent 4 years watching an institution decide that certain harms were acceptable. She wanted to be certain she remembered every single one of them. Now, if this story is making you feel something right now, I want to ask you to stay with this channel. Cold Reckoning exists to tell exactly these stories, the ones that get buried, the ones that get managed, the ones where the truth exists, but the system is built to keep it contained. Subscribe if you haven't. This story is not finished. The morning of the hearing, Marsh put on a gray blazer. She ate breakfast alone. She took a taxi to the Capitol. She carried nothing except her phone, her ID, and her original employee badge in the inside pocket of her jacket. She had kept the badge for a specific reason, not sentiment. When she left the company, she had been asked to surrender her badge at the front desk. She had done so. But several months earlier, when she had first started considering her options, she had quietly requested a replacement badge, citing a damaged original. The company had issued her a new one. She still had it. She had never used it to access the building after requesting the replacement. She had simply kept it. It was hers. It had her name on it. She had earned it. What she did not know when she sat down at the witness table was that the company had already sent a representative to the committee. That representative had provided the committee staff with documentation claiming that Elena Marsh had not been a senior researcher at the company, had not led the studies she was claiming to have led, and had in fact been a junior contractor whose employment had ended due to performance issues. The documentation appeared official. It had letterheads and signatures and HR file numbers. It was fabricated, entirely and deliberately fabricated. The committee chair, to his credit, allowed Marsh to proceed before raising the company's submission. He wanted to hear what she had to say. What she said over the course of 6 hours was this. She described the cohort behavioral mapping program in technical detail, precise enough that anyone with a background in data science would immediately recognize it as authentic. She described the methodology of each of her 4 reports, the specific statistical models used, the sample sizes, the confidence intervals, the control groups. She described the 3 outcome clusters, anxiety indicators, appearance-related distress, and the depression engagement amplification pattern, with the clinical specificity of a researcher who had spent years inside the data. She cited no documents. She read from no files. Every single number she spoke aloud had been retrieved from inside her own memory. At the 2-hour mark, a senator from the opposing party attempted to question her credibility by citing the company's submission. Marsh listened to the question without expression. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and placed her employee badge on the table. I have been told that according to the company's records, I never worked there. This badge was issued to me by the company on my first day of employment. It has my photograph, my name, my title, and the date of issuance. If their records say I didn't exist, their records are wrong. I have been sitting 4 feet from their legal team for the past 2 hours. I invite them to tell this committee, under oath, that they have never seen my face before. The legal team said nothing. The hearing continued for 4 more hours. By the time Marsh finished her testimony, the company's stock had dropped 18%, not because of a single revelation, because of the cumulative weight of specificity. Because a person who had not worked somewhere does not know what she knew. Because you cannot memorize 4 years of internal research that doesn't exist. The aftermath was not a movie ending. There was no single law passed. There was no executive arrested. The company paid a regulatory fine that amounted to less than 3 days of revenue. Several internal policy changes were announced and partially implemented. The NDA was never challenged because Marsh had never technically violated it. But something else happened, something harder to measure and more important than any fine. The phrase acceptable friction entered the public record. A senator repeated it in a floor speech. A newspaper put it in a headline. Within 72 hours, it had been seen by more than 60 million people. Parents who had watched their daughters disappear into their phones now had a phrase for what had happened. Researchers who had been trying to publish studies on adolescent mental health and social media suddenly found their work being cited in places it had never reached before. The conversation shifted in a way that institutional responses could not fully manage. Elena Marsh did not become famous. She did not want to be famous. She gave 2 more interviews in the months following the testimony, then largely withdrew from public life. She took a position at a university research center, studying the long-term behavioral effects of recommendation systems on developing cognition. She works there now. In one of her final interviews, a journalist asked her whether she regretted signing the NDA. She thought about it for a long moment. Then she said, "I signed an agreement that covered everything I had seen. I'm glad I saw enough to remember." There are things this story asks us to sit with that don't have clean answers. It asks us to consider what it means when a company's internal vocabulary includes the phrase acceptable friction to describe the mental health deterioration of children. It asks us to consider who decided what was acceptable and what process led to that decision, and how many people sat in how many rooms and said nothing because the engagement numbers were good. It asks us to consider what we mean when we say a platform is engineered. Because engineering implies intention. It implies that someone made choices, that the outcomes were not accidental, but designed, and that the design was reviewed, and that the review concluded with a filed document and a continued algorithm and a teenage girl in a dark bedroom at midnight, checking her phone for the 47th time, waiting for something that would make her feel less alone, while the system that was supposed to connect her was quietly measuring the depth of her need and finding it useful. It asks us to consider what Elena Marsh gave up. Not the $4 million, though that is not nothing. The career she imagined when she was 27 years old and idealistic enough to believe that data, in the right hands, could protect people. The belief that the institution she joined shared her values. She gave up the version of herself that needed that to be true. And it asks us to consider what she kept: the badge, the numbers, the willingness to sit in a room for 6 hours and say, clearly and calmly, and without a single document in front of her, here is what I know, here is how I know it, and I am not going to pretend I don't know it because you need me not to. That is not a small thing. In a world where institutions are very good at making inconvenient knowledge disappear, the decision to remember is an act of resistance. The data she memorized described children. Real children with names their parents chose carefully, with futures their families imagined, with nervous systems that were still developing when the algorithm first learned what kind of content made them stay just a little longer. The data described what happened to those nervous systems over months and years of optimized engagement. The data used words like friction and acceptable and retention. It did not use words like daughter or son or patient or child. She remembered the numbers. She also remembered what the numbers were about. This is Cold Reckoning. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to know what else has been buried. The next story is already waiting. And if you have ever worked inside one of these systems and you know something and you are trying to figure out what to do with what you know, I want you to hear this. Elena Marsh signed a 47-page NDA and still found a way to tell the truth. The truth has more endurance than the systems designed to contain it. It always has. She kept the badge, she kept the numbers, she walked into the room. That's the whole story, and it's entirely true.